"Here's to my new father-in-law," he said, raising his glass to me in front of 300 guests. Despite being a simple carpenter who showed up reeking of pine, he somehow scraped together enough money to pay for this wedding. Laughter echoed through the opulent hall I had bled for. I stood there, humiliated in my ill-fitting suit, watching my own daughter look away in shame. After 30 years of backbreaking work and endless sacrifice to give her this perfect day, this was my reward, to be the punchline in my new son-in-law's joke. A stranger watched me from across the room, his expression unreadable. But no one in that ballroom, least of all my daughter, could ever guess the multi-million-dollar secret I was hiding, and it was about to change everything. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you're listening from in the comments. The banquet hall at the Crestview Gardens was everything Olivia had ever wanted. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the 300 guests. Elegant white calla lilies adorned each table, and a jazz band played smooth melodies in the corner of the room. I'd worked 16-hour days for 2 years to afford this moment. Every extra shift, every skipped meal, every saved penny had led to tonight. I stood at the back of the hall, watching my 28-year-old daughter dance with her new husband, Preston. She looked radiant in her designer gown, a dress that cost more than I made in 3 months. My chest swelled with pride, even as a deep exhaustion settled on my shoulders. This is worth it. It's all worth it. The splinters and sawdust under my fingernails had been scrubbed clean. My best suit was pressed and laundered, though it still felt shabby compared to the tuxedos around me. Preston's family moved through the crowd as if they owned the place, chattering about their vacation homes and investment portfolios. I didn't belong, but it didn't matter. Tonight was about Olivia's happiness. The clinking of a knife against a crystal glass interrupted my thoughts. Preston stood at the head table, microphone in hand, his perfectly styled hair glinting under the lights. The room fell silent as he smiled, the same charming smile that had won over my daughter 3 years ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, his voice effortlessly carrying through the opulent space, "thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this incredible moment with Olivia and me." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. I stood a little straighter, anticipating a kind word about family bonds, about love transcending differences. Olivia beamed at her new husband, her eyes sparkling with adoration. "I'd like to make a special toast," Preston continued, raising his champagne flute. His eyes found me across the room, and something cold flashed in them. "To my new father-in-law, Elias." My heart skipped a beat. 300 pairs of eyes turned in my direction. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as I gave a small, awkward wave. This was it. Maybe Preston was finally going to acknowledge how hard I'd worked to make this day a reality. Despite being a simple carpenter who showed up tonight still reeking of pine and wood glue, embarrassing my beautiful bride, he somehow managed to scrape together enough money to pay for this wedding. The words hit me like a physical blow. A burst of laughter erupted from some of Preston's friends, while other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My legs trembled, my vision blurring. The luxurious ballroom suddenly felt like a courtroom where I'd been convicted of being working class. I looked desperately toward Olivia, waiting for her to defend me, to tell her husband he'd gone too far. Instead, she stared down at her plate, her cheeks flushed with shame. My own daughter was ashamed of me. "So, here's to Elias," Preston continued, either oblivious or perhaps relishing my breakdown, "for proving that even the most unlikely people can surprise us with their generosity." The applause that followed felt like needles against my skin. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the marble floor and never face anyone again. My hand trembled as I gripped the back of a nearby chair, trying to steady myself. 58 years of life, 30 years of marriage to my late wife, Sarah. 28 years of raising Olivia on my own after Sarah's death. And this was what it all amounted to, a public humiliation at my own daughter's wedding. I thought about walking out right then, just turning my back and leaving this place where I so clearly didn't belong. But something held me there. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah making me promise to always look after our little girl. Maybe it was the stubborn pride that had gotten me through decades of hard, unacknowledged labor. As Preston sat down, basking in the laughter of his friends, I noticed a man at table 12 staring at me. He was about my age, dressed in a simple dark suit, but something in his demeanor commanded attention. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. His expression was serious, almost calculating. Our eyes met for a moment, and he gave me a slight, deliberate nod. I didn't know who he was, but in that moment of complete isolation, that small gesture of acknowledgement felt like a lifeline. The reception continued around me, but I felt like I was underwater, watching life happen through a distorted lens. Guests returned to their conversations. The music resumed, and waiters began serving the expensive dinner I had paid for. No one seemed to remember or care what had just happened, except for the man at table 12. He kept watching, and something in his steady gaze made me stand a little taller. I had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything was about to change. As I stood there, humiliated and shaking, my mind drifted back to a time when my life had been full of promise. 35 years ago, I wasn't just Elias, the carpenter. I was Elias Vance, a mechanical engineering graduate from State University, top of my class, with a full scholarship and 3 job offers from major engineering firms. The future stretched out before me like a wide-open highway, full of possibilities I could barely imagine. Then I met Sarah in a campus coffee shop. She was studying to be a nurse. Her laugh was infectious, her dreams as big as mine. We were married 6 months after graduation, both of us ready to take on the world together. I took a job at Stonewell Construction, their youngest structural engineer, working on cutting-edge designs for timber skyscrapers. Life was perfect until it wasn't. Sarah's pregnancy with Olivia was complicated. Severe morning sickness lasted all 9 months. Then came the postpartum depression that left her barely able to function. The medical bills began to pile up. My entry-level engineering salary barely covered our basic needs, let alone the specialists Sarah required. When Olivia was 2, Sarah was diagnosed with lupus. The woman who used to dance around our tiny kitchen was suddenly confined to her bed for days at a time, her joints swollen, her energy completely depleted. She needed constant care, expensive medications, and frequent hospital visits. I tried to balance it all. Work during the day, caring for Sarah and Olivia at night. My engineering projects spread across the kitchen table long after everyone was asleep. But something had to give, and Stonewell Construction wasn't interested in engineers who couldn't work 70-hour weeks. "We need team players here, Elias," my supervisor had said when I asked for more flexible hours. "If you can't fully commit, maybe this isn't the right place for you." I lasted another 6 months before they let me go, citing performance issues that were really just me leaving at 5:30 on the dot to pick up Olivia from daycare and rush to the pharmacy for Sarah's prescriptions. The decision to open a small wood shop felt like giving up on everything I had worked for. But Sarah needed stability. Olivia needed food and clothes. And I needed a way to provide for them that didn't depend on anyone else's sympathy. Vance's Woodworks started in a rented garage with tools bought on credit and a prayer that customers would come. The first few years were brutal. 16-hour days became the norm. My hands were perpetually stained with grease, my back aching from hunching over saw tables and heavy slabs of wood. My college friends, who used to call about engineering projects, gradually stopped reaching out. Sarah tried to help when she could, handling the books on her good days. But the lupus was relentless. Some mornings I'd find her crying at the kitchen table, frustrated by her body's betrayal, guilty that I had to carry everything alone. "You gave up your dreams for us," she whispered one night after a particularly bad flare-up landed us in the emergency room. "You and Olivia are my dream," I told her, and I meant it, even as my engineering textbooks gathered dust on a shelf. Even as my old classmates sent Christmas cards from their suburban homes, talking about their promotions and business trips. When Sarah died from complications of lupus 6 years later, Olivia was only 8. I became her everything: father, mother, taxi driver, homework helper, cheerleader at school events. The woodshop kept us afloat, but just barely. I remember the night Olivia came home from middle school, crying because her friends were talking about their fathers' jobs. "Why can't you be a doctor or a lawyer, like Madison's dad?" she asked through her tears. I sat on her bed, my work clothes traded for old jeans, and tried to explain that success isn't just about the job title you have. But how do you tell a 13-year-old that sometimes love requires sacrifice, that sometimes being a hero means getting your hands dirty? By high school, Olivia had learned to be vague about my work. "My dad works with wood" sounded better than "my dad is a carpenter." I pretended not to notice when she had her friends drop her off a block away from the shop. College applications brought new challenges. Olivia wanted to go to prestigious schools, and I wanted that for her too. I took on more work, expanded the shop, hired 2 guys so I could take on fleet maintenance contracts with local businesses. Every extra dollar went into her college fund. "Dad, you don't have to work so hard," she'd said during her senior year. But her eyes were already on the future, on escaping our small town and the life that embarrassed her. I worked harder anyway, because that's what a father does, because Sarah would have wanted Olivia to have every opportunity, because I loved my daughter more than my own comfort. She graduated with a business degree, got a good job in marketing, and met Preston at a corporate conference. When she brought him home to meet me, I saw his eyes scan the small house, the work clothes hanging by the door, and the calloused hand I offered to his perfectly manicured one. "So, you're in construction too," he'd said that first night, and I could hear the condescension in his voice. "Something like that," I replied, not wanting to embarrass Olivia by detailing the difference between a structural engineer and a man who works with his hands. Now, standing in this banquet hall that had cost me 2 years of my life, watching my daughter avoid my gaze after her husband publicly humiliated me, I wondered if all those sacrifices had been worth it. But as I looked around the room, my eyes fell again on the man at table 12. He was still watching me with that intense expression, and something about his focus made me think he understood more than anyone else in this room. I had no idea he was about to change everything. The man at table 12 slowly rose from his seat, and something in his movement caused a ripple of attention to spread through the room. He wasn't tall or particularly imposing, but he carried an air of quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. I watched him make his way to the front of the hall, weaving between tables with the confident stride of a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. His simple dark suit looked expensive up close. It was the kind of understated elegance that spoke of wealth quietly, rather than shouting it. Preston, still basking in the afterglow of his cruel toast, noticed the man approaching and extended a hand with his practiced political smile. "Enjoying the party?" The man ignored the outstretched hand completely, his eyes sweeping over the room before settling on the abandoned microphone. "Actually, I have something I'd like to say." There was something in his tone that made Preston instinctively take a step back. The man picked up the microphone with the casual familiarity of someone used to addressing crowds, though he looked more like a professor than a public speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice came through the sound system, calm but powerful. "My name is James Albright. I apologize for interrupting your evening, but I feel compelled to share something of importance with you." A murmur went through the crowd. I saw several guests exchange glances, whispering to one another. The name seemed to mean something to some of them, though it was lost on me. Preston looked confused, his earlier confidence wavering. "I'm sorry, who are you exactly?" "I don't recall your name on the guest list." James's smile was thin, almost a sneer. "I'm here as a guest of Elias Vance, though I doubt he remembers inviting me." My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't remember inviting this man. I'd never met him before tonight. How did he know about the wedding? And why would he claim to be my guest? James continued, his gaze sweeping the room with ease. "You see, I've known Elias for quite some time. 15 years, to be exact, though our relationship has been, let's call it, discreet." The confusion in the room was palpable. Olivia was looking at me with wide eyes, clearly wondering who this mystery man was and why I'd never mentioned him. Preston looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "I've been watching tonight's festivities with great interest," James went on, his tone conversational but with a steel undercurrent, "especially that charming toast from the groom about his new father-in-law." Preston paled slightly, perhaps sensing that his moment of triumph was about to be challenged. "It's funny how people make assumptions," James mused, almost to himself. "They see a man in work clothes and think they know his whole story. They see calloused hands and assume that's all there is to see." I felt my pulse quicken. Where was this going? What did this stranger know about me? James's eyes found me across the room. "Elias, you've been very humble about your accomplishments. Perhaps too humble." The room was utterly silent now. All 300 guests were hanging on his every word. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "You see," James addressed the room again, "I'm what you might call a talent scout in the architecture and construction industry. I look for innovations, for brilliant minds that might be overlooked by the traditional corporate structure." Preston frowned, his confusion deepening. "What does any of this have to do with anything?" James's smile was now as sharp as a blade being drawn from its sheath. 15 years ago, I was investigating reports of unusual structural modifications being made to small-scale projects undertaken by a local woodshop. The improvements were remarkable. The structures were stronger, their load-bearing capabilities enhanced, and they used materials far more efficiently than the original blueprints called for. My hands began to shake. I remembered those modifications, the late nights in the shop tinkering with ideas that had been rattling around in my head since my engineering days. I never thought anyone had noticed or cared. "When I traced the source of these improvements," James said, "I found a former structural engineer from Stonewell Construction running a small wood shop, a man whose innovative solutions were being quietly implemented without patents or fanfare simply because he wanted to build a better product." The room was now completely still. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. James turned to face me directly. "Elias Vance, former structural engineer, current genius-level innovator, whose designs for load-bearing joints have been quietly revolutionizing the construction industry for over a decade." "That's impossible," Preston stammered. "He's just a carpenter. He builds furniture." James laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "He doesn't just build furniture, young man. He reinvents how it's built. And those reinventions, well, they attracted the attention of some very important people in Chicago." I felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. The late nights of tinkering, the small modifications I made to give my clients a better product, they were just the restless urges of an engineering mind that wouldn't quiet down. "In fact," James continued, his voice gaining strength, "Elias's innovations have been incorporated into 3 major construction patents over the last decade, patents that have generated significant revenue for the companies smart enough to license them." Preston was shaking his head in disbelief. "You're making this up. If any of this were true, he wouldn't be living in that tiny house, working with his hands." James's expression hardened. "That, Mr. Hayes, shows just how little you understand about the man whose daughter you just married. Elias Vance could have lived a very different life, but he chose to stay here, to keep working with his hands, to stay close to his roots and his daughter." The words hung in the air, and I felt something shift inside me. Memories were surfacing now. Phone calls I'd dismissed as sales pitches, legal documents I'd signed without fully understanding, checks that had seemed too good to be true. James wasn't finished. "Which brings me to why I'm here tonight. Elias, I think it's time these good people knew the truth about exactly who they've been dining with." The anticipation in the room was suffocating. Preston looked like he was going to be sick. Olivia was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, and I realized that my life was about to change forever. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather-bound portfolio that looked like it had seen years of important meetings. That simple gesture somehow made the entire ballroom feel smaller, more intimate, as if we were all about to witness something that would change everything. "Elias," James said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent when he spoke to Preston, "do you remember signing these documents?" He opened the portfolio and held up several official-looking papers. Even from across the room, I could see my signature on them, though I couldn't recall the specific circumstances. "The first," James continued, "was for a design for a load-distributing joint you developed, which increased the strength of timber beams by 30%, while reducing raw material use by 15%. A major construction conglomerate licensed that technology for their entire line of prefabricated homes back in 2019. My knees nearly buckled. I remembered that modification, the weeks I'd spent perfecting it for Mrs. Miller's old barn because she couldn't afford a rebuild. I'd done the adjustments for free just to help her out. The papers James had brought me later seemed like routine patent protection. The second, James held up another document, was for a new treatment process for laminated wood that made it almost perfectly resistant to moisture and warping, eliminating the need for major replacements for up to 50 years. A leading flooring manufacturer bought the exclusive rights to that one. The room was spinning. Preston was completely ashen, his earlier confidence gone like mist in the morning sun. Several guests were whispering furiously to one another, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. James smiled at me, and for the first time tonight, someone's smile felt genuine. "And the third, which we just finalized last month, concerns a composite insulation material made from wood scraps that can retain heat 40% more efficiently than standard fiberglass." "This is insane," Preston said, his voice trembling. "If this was real, he'd be rich. He'd be famous. He wouldn't be working in some dirty wood shop." James's expression turned to ice as he turned back to Preston. "Rich? Let me tell you about rich young man." He pulled out what looked like a financial statement and adjusted a pair of reading glasses. "Elias Vance, as co-inventor and patent holder, has earned somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 million in royalties over the past 15 years. The number hit the room like a thunderclap. I heard gasps, saw some people physically lean forward in their chairs. Olivia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "But those are just the licensing fees," James continued, clearly enjoying the effect of his words. "As my business partner in Albright Vance Designs, Elias owns 40% of a company currently valued at $12 million. I gripped the back of the nearest chair to keep from falling. Business partner, company valuation. These were terms from a life I had never imagined living. Preston shook his head violently. "That's not possible." "If he had that kind of money, why would he be a carpenter? Why would he live in that tiny little house?" James's smile was razor-sharp. "Because unlike some people, Elias Vance understands that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account or the size of his house. He chose to live humbly because he wanted to be near his daughter, to be the man who raised her with love and sacrifice." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something shift inside me. The memories were flooding back now. The phone calls I'd dismissed as sales pitches, the legal documents I'd signed without fully understanding, the checks that had seemed too good to be true. James wasn't done. He chose to live simply because he values relationships over material possessions. He chose to pay for this wedding with money earned from his woodshop, not from his royalty accounts, because he wanted to show his daughter that her happiness was worth his sacrifice. Olivia was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at me with an expression of mingled horror and regret. For the first time all night, she seemed to be truly seeing me. James turned to address Preston directly. "So, when you called this man a simple carpenter who scraped together money for this wedding, you weren't just insulting a man from a different social class. You were insulting a millionaire inventor who chose to hide his wealth rather than flaunt it." Preston looked like he was going to be sick. The blood had drained from his face, and he was gripping the edge of the head table with white knuckles. "But here's the part that really gets me," James continued, his voice almost conversational. "Elias never told anyone about his financial situation. Not his daughter, not his friends, not even his family. Do you know why?" The room waited in absolute silence. "Because he wanted to be loved for who he was, not for what he had. He wanted his daughter to be proud of him as a father, not impressed by him as a rich man. He wanted genuine connections, not relationships built on a bank balance." James's eyes found mine again. "Elias, you protected everyone from the truth of your success because you were afraid it would change how they saw you. But after tonight, I think it's time they saw you clearly." I felt hot tears welling in my own eyes. All those years of hiding, of letting people look down on me, of watching my daughter feel ashamed of what she thought was my failure. It had all been to protect this dream of genuine love, of authentic connection. But the look on Preston's face told me everything I needed to know about how genuine his feelings were. James snapped his portfolio shut with a clean, definitive click. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have been dining tonight as the guests of Elias Vance, millionaire inventor and one of the most brilliant creative minds in the construction industry. A man who chose to serve you from his heart, not impress you with his wallet." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, someone at table 8 began to clap. Others joined in until the entire room was filled with applause. But this felt different from the polite clapping after Preston's cruel toast. This felt like respect, like acknowledgement, as if people were seeing me for the very first time. Preston stood frozen at the head table, his face ashen, his dreams of superiority collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. and for the first time in 30 years, I stood up completely straight, my shoulders back, finally ready to face the consequences of the truth. The applause died down, leaving a silence as heavy as the quiet before a storm. Preston stood at the head table, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. Confusion, disbelief, panic, and finally, desperate calculation. He cleared his throat and forced that political smile back onto his face, though it looked strained and artificial now. "Well, this is quite a surprise," he said into the microphone, his voice trembling slightly. "Elias, I had no idea about your accomplishments." I just looked at him, my expression unreadable, saying nothing. After 30 years of swallowing my pride, of accepting disrespect to keep the peace, I found I had no forgiving words ready. Preston's smile faltered under my silence. "I mean, if I had known about your business success, I never would have." He trailed off, seeming to realize that finishing that sentence would only make things worse. "You never would have what?" James's voice cut through the awkwardness like a knife. "Treated him with basic human decency? Shown gratitude to the man who paid for your wedding?" The room watched this exchange with the rapt attention of onlookers at a car crash. 300 guests who had come for champagne and dancing were now witnessing the complete and total demolition of a man's character in real time. Preston turned to me, his hands shaking as he set the microphone down. "Elias, please, you have to understand, it was a joke, just a little teasing between family." "Family?" I repeated the word slowly, tasting the bitter irony of it. "Is that what you call humiliating someone in front of 300 people?" Olivia rose from the head table, her wedding dress rustling as she made her way toward me. Her makeup was streaked with tears, her perfectly coiffed hair a mess where she'd run her hands through it. She looked younger suddenly, vulnerable in a way that reminded me of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap after a bad dream. "Daddy," she whispered, the childhood name she hadn't used in years slipping out. "I'm so sorry." I didn't know. I never knew about any of it. I looked at my daughter, the woman I had raised and sacrificed for, who had sat in silence while her husband tore me to shreds in public. "You didn't know about the patents or the royalties," I said quietly, "but you knew who I was. You knew I was the father who loved you, who worked every single day to give you the best life I could, and you let him humiliate me anyway." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I was ashamed," she admitted, her voice breaking. "All my friends' fathers were doctors and lawyers and businessmen. I was ashamed that my father was just a carpenter." "Just a carpenter?" I repeated, feeling the weight of those words. "Your mother was a nurse, Olivia." "Did that make her just a nurse? Do you think honest work is something to be ashamed of?" She was sobbing openly now, her expensive makeup running in rivulets down her cheeks. "No, I don't know what I was thinking. Preston always said—" "What did Preston always say?" James interjected, his voice sharp with interest. Olivia shot a nervous glance at her new husband, who was trying to signal for her to stop talking. "He said that successful people don't work with their hands, that if you had any real talent, you would have made something bigger of yourself." The confession hung in the air like toxic smoke. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. The last vestiges of fatherly protection crumbled away. Preston stepped forward, his desperation now palpable. "Elias, please, you have to understand my position. I come from a certain background with certain expectations. I was trying to live up to my family's standards." "Your family's standards?" I said slowly. "Tell me, Preston, what do your family's standards say about a man who insults his father-in-law at his own wedding?" About a man who accepts money for an expensive celebration and then publicly shames the person who provided it. Preston's face went white again. He looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support, but found only watching faces and uncomfortable silence. James moved closer to the head table, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller. "I'm curious about something, Preston. What is it you do for a living exactly?" Preston squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim some shred of authority. "I'm a financial consultant." "And how much do you make a year, consulting on finances?" James's question was casual, but everyone in the room understood its intent. That's private financial information," Preston stammered. James smiled, that sneering smile again. "Elias made $847,000 last year between his woodshop income and his patent royalties. He spent $65,000 on this wedding. Would you care to tell everyone how much you contributed?" The silence was suffocating. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking like a fish gasping for air. Olivia turned to her husband, a look of dawning horror on her face. "Preston, how much did you contribute to our wedding?" "It's not about the money," Preston said weakly, but his voice had lost all conviction. "You're right," I said, standing taller. "It's not about the money. It's about respect. It's about gratitude. It's about treating people with basic human dignity, regardless of what you think their station in life is." I walked toward the head table, my steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted as I moved, 300 faces following me with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. "Preston," I said as I reached him. My voice was calm, but it carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "You wanted everyone here to know that you think I'm beneath you, that marrying my daughter was somehow lowering your standards. Well, now everyone knows exactly who we both are." I turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to celebrate my daughter's wedding. The bar is open, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your evening." Then I looked at Olivia, my heart breaking as I said the words I never thought I would have to say. "Olivia, I love you. I will always love you, but I will not be disrespected in my own family, not by your husband, and not by your silence." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a bank transfer slip I'd prepared weeks ago, money for their honeymoon and their first year's mortgage payments, $50,000 I'd planned to surprise them with after the reception. I tore the paper in two and let the pieces flutter to the floor. "When you're ready to have a real conversation about respect and family, you know where to find me." I walked toward the exit, leaving behind the whispers, the shocked faces, and the daughter who had chosen her husband's approval over her father's dignity. For the first time in 30 years, I was walking away from a fight instead of absorbing the blows, and it felt like freedom. 6 months later, I stood on the porch of a log cabin in Wyoming, watching the sunrise paint the majestic peaks in shades of gold and rose. The coffee in my hand tasted better than anything I'd ever had before. Maybe it was because for the first time in decades, I was drinking it without worrying about getting to the shop on time or paying someone else's bills. The silence here was different from the silence in my old house after Olivia moved out. That had been the silence of emptiness, of deferred dreams and unacknowledged love. This was the silence of peace, of a man finally free to discover who he was when he wasn't trying to be everything to someone else. My phone buzzed on the wooden railing beside me. A text from James. "Those architects in Chicago want to meet next week about the lightweight composite beam design. Interested?" I smiled, typing back, "Only if we can do it over video call. I'm not cutting this vacation short." Vacation. The word still felt foreign in my mouth. I had worked every day for the past 30 years, through holidays and weekends and family emergencies. Now I was learning how to wake up without a schedule, to eat lunch when I was hungry instead of when I could squeeze in 5 minutes between clients. The money had always been there, accumulating in accounts I rarely checked, earning interest on investments James managed with my informal consent. But it wasn't the money that had changed things. It was the permission to finally stop apologizing for who I was. Another buzz. This time, a longer message from an unknown number. "Dad, it's Olivia. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed you to know that Preston and I are getting a divorce. I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, watching the steam rise from my coffee mug. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad for the pain my daughter was undoubtedly going through. But mostly, I felt something I didn't expect. Indifference. The desperate need to fix her problems, to rush in and make everything better, was gone. She was 28 years old, and she had made her choices, just as I was finally making mine. I texted back, "I'm glad you're safe. I'm traveling right now, but we can talk when I get back. But Olivia, things are going to be different between us now." Her response was immediate. "I know. I'm sorry, Dad. For everything." I set the phone aside and went back to watching the sunrise. Sorry was a start, but it wasn't enough to rebuild what had been broken. That would take time and effort and a fundamental shift in how we related to each other. Later that morning, I drove into the small mountain town for supplies. The owner of the fishing tackle shop, a friendly man named Hank, who knew nothing about my patents or royalties, had become something of a friend over the past month. "Morning, Elias," he called out as I walked in. "How's that porch project coming along?" "Almost done," I replied, selecting the wood stain I needed. "It'll be ready for those chairs I ordered." "Good on you. Nothing like building something with your own two hands, is there?" I smiled, thinking of the contrast between this conversation and the ones I'd had at Olivia's wedding. Here, no one cared about my bank account or my patents. They cared if I showed up on time, if I did good work, if I treated people with respect. It was refreshing to be judged on character instead of accomplishments. The bell over the door jingled, and a woman about my age walked in, shaking snow from her coat. I'd seen her around town a few times, but we'd never spoken. "Morning, Hank," she called, then gave me a polite nod. "Excuse me, are you the fella in the Jenkins cabin up on Ridge Road?" "That's me," I replied. "Elias Vance." "Clara Reed," she introduced herself with a warm smile. "I live just down the mountain from you. I wanted to invite you to our community potluck this Saturday, if you're interested. We get together once a month. Nothing fancy." I felt something lighten in my chest. "I'd love that. What should I bring?" "Just yourself," she said, "unless you can cook." "Can you cook?" I laughed, surprised by how genuine it sounded. "I make a mean beef stew. Learned out of necessity when my daughter was little." "Perfect. 6 o'clock at the community center." After she left, Hank grinned at me. "Clara's good people. Lost her husband a few years back. Moved up here for the quiet. You could do worse for a friend." I paid for my supplies, thinking about the invitation. When was the last time I'd been invited somewhere just for my own company? When was the last time I'd been excited to meet new people instead of dreading their judgment? That evening, I called James for a business update. Our partnership had evolved into something resembling friendship over the months, built on mutual respect rather than necessity. "You sound different," he commented after we'd gone over the technical details of our latest project. "Different how?" "Relaxed. Like you're finally living in your own skin instead of trying to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be." He was right. For 30 years, I'd been trying to be the father Olivia needed, the provider my family required, the humble carpenter who didn't make waves. I had been so busy being what other people needed that I'd forgotten to explore what I wanted. "I got a text from Olivia today," I told him. "How do you feel about that?" I considered the question seriously. Sad for her. She's going through a divorce, dealing with the fallout of marrying someone who only valued her as an accessory, but I'm not rushing to her rescue anymore. "That's growth," James said approvingly. "What are you going to do?" "Talk to her when I'm ready. Set some boundaries. See if we can build something real instead of something based on guilt and obligation." 3 weeks later, I met Olivia at a diner halfway between her city and my mountain town. She looked older, more tired, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years: humility. "You look good, Dad," she said as we sat across from each other in a booth. "Happy?" "I am happy," I replied simply. She fiddled with her coffee cup, struggling to find the words. "Preston left me for his secretary 2 months after the wedding. Turns out he'd been having an affair with her for over a year." I felt a flash of anger on her behalf, but it was distant, controlled. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Are you?" she asked, looking me straight in the eye. "Olivia, I love you. I will always love you. But I'm not going to pretend your choices didn't hurt me, or that we can go back to the way things were." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I was awful to you. I was so worried about what other people thought that I forgot what was right." We talked for 2 hours. Really talked. Maybe for the first time since she was a little girl. I told her about the loneliness I'd felt, watching her grow up ashamed of the life I had built for us. She told me about the pressure she'd felt to live up to Preston's expectations, to be someone worthy of his family's approval. "I want to try again," she said as we were getting ready to leave, "if you're willing. But I understand if you need time." I hugged her goodbye, and for the first time in years, it felt real. "We'll take it slow," I promised, "and things will be different." 6 months after that conversation, Olivia came to visit me in Wyoming. She met Clara, who had indeed become a good friend, and the other friends I'd made in the community. She saw me relaxed and confident in a way she'd never witnessed growing up. "You seem like a different person," she commented on her last night as we sat on the porch, watching the stars. "I'm the same person I've always been," I replied. "I just finally stopped apologizing for it." She was quiet for a long time. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not because of the patents or the money, but because you had the courage to walk away from people who didn't value you, even when one of those people was me." Looking up at the vast Wyoming sky, I felt something that had been missing for 30 years: contentment. Not the desperate happiness that comes from someone else's approval, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man at peace with his own choices. I had lost my daughter for a while, but I had found myself, and in the end, that's what allowed me to have them both. Thank you for listening to the story until the end. If you've ever been through a similar situation or have any thoughts on this story, please share them in the comments so we can discuss them together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.